I'm going to call this debate to order on our resolution resolved. Exposure to extreme views contributes to education on campus. I am looking for a speech in the affirmative, and we are going to start with Ms. Claire Ashcraft.
Thank you. So this resolution hinges a lot on the word extreme. What is extreme? Is voting for Donald Trump considered extreme on some campuses? Because nearly half the country voted for him. And I would consider learning about that sect of the population to be integral to an education. Is Marxism extreme on the other end? Because I've learned about him in at least 3 of my college classes so far, most of them only tangentially related, if that. Another topic that might be an issue is a lot of people consider veganism to be extreme, for example. I am vegan and I actually would consider the reverse. I think that it's extreme as a society that we allow so many people to go their entire lives without questioning animal consumption. I think factory farming causes extraordinary harm to animals, and extraordinary harm calls for extraordinary justification. I think most of you on this call would probably disagree with my view that eating meat is extreme, which brings me to another question. Who's more right? Who gets to determine what extreme is? Is it the professors, the students, the administrators? Because personally, I wouldn't trust any one of those groups to say what I can or can't learn. Now let's put that issue aside for a moment. Assume we've all agreed on what qualifies as extreme and that extreme views aren't useful. But then what do we do with the people who hold those views on campus? Are they censored? Do we rescind their admission so they can't educate themselves and potentially change their views? I think the reality is if we don't allow extreme views out in the open, they don't go away, but they go underground. If people don't feel heard, they'll become defensive and dig their heels in even more. I've spoken to people on the far right who've been disrespectful and aggressive to me because they feel like they get attacked on the daily, even by people close to them. For example, the other day I was talking to someone who casually described himself as to the right of Ted Cruz, but to the left of Hitler. And I didn't immediately shut down that conversation. Even though we disagree vehemently on many things, we both agreed that it's important to talk to people with different beliefs and break out of our echo chambers. So no matter how terrible I find some of his views, it's important to me that he feels treated as an equal and feels heard. Otherwise, he could shut down and turn to more extreme beliefs. Now, imagine entire generations go through college without encountering beliefs like this. If they were met with someone like this, would they just say his views aren't allowed? I think that's how we turn people to violent extremist movements. So to summarize, I think we have a practical problem of first describing what extreme is and determining whose opinions are prioritized in defining it. But I also think it's in our interest to include truly extreme beliefs in education. It benefits the people who hold those beliefs to be respected and hear opposing sides. This might make them more moderate, but I do want to acknowledge that extreme doesn't always equal wrong or dangerous beliefs. But I think it also helps those with moderate beliefs stay more safe by learning how to speak to extremists so they don't put themselves in a potentially dangerous situation or unintentionally drive people towards more extremist groups. At the end of the day, education is all about learning and exposure. And when we learn how to navigate the world and people in the world have extreme beliefs, I think naturally it should become a part of our education. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Round of jazz hands for our speaker. If you want to ask a question of our speaker, if you go ahead and raise your Zoom hand, we're going to start off with John. You can unmute yourself and ask a question to me.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the person thinks that what are her thoughts on allowing a person like former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, David Duke, or Nation of Islam Minister Louis Farrakhan to speak in the college campus, despite their extreme views on race?
Great. Thank you so much. Ms. Ashcraft, you have 1 minute to answer, up to 1 minute.
I would say that's up to each individual campus. Generally, I lean more towards free speech, that if they really want to speak and students want them to speak by inviting them, then I would say that they might be allowed to speak. But I think that's ultimately a conversation between the students and the administration and what they decide, because much like a business can reject anyone they want for any reason, I think a school in a similar sense should be able to. I just wouldn't want that personally to become the norm, but it's ultimately up to them.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Ms. Cornfield, if you'd unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The speaker said, so I was very persuaded by the speaker's remarks. I thought they were excellent. However, there was one point that I wanted to ask her about. She said that the way that you create a violent extremist is that you refuse to listen to them and hear them out. And I wanted to push her on that for a second, because my impression is that violent extremists, extremist groups can recruit more easily when their ideas are more accepted by the mainstream. And I wanted to find out if she thinks that social shunning is effective sometimes as a way to shut down extreme views, and therefore whether her it really is the case that it's not a good idea to shun certain kinds of views.
Great, thank you. Ms. Ashcraft, you have up to a minute to answer.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from on that point, because
Where
I
she's
do
coming
think
from.
where she's coming from,
Yeah.
because I think that we shouldn't accept extreme views like into mainstream culture and say that they're fine. I certainly don't think discussing these topics means that we're validating any position, but I could also see that if a young person was recruited into an extremist group and because of that shunning, it just alienated them, pushed them more towards that group rather than exposing them to different ideas. So if we shun people completely, then that's also like cutting them off from the flow of ideas generally. So I think it's dangerous to cut them off completely, but we also shouldn't encourage those ideas. And I think there is a balance of like creating an environment where we can talk about these ideas while still not encouraging and platforming them, but acknowledging and hearing how people came to those beliefs.
Great, and with that, our speaker is thanked. All right, I am now looking for a speech in the negative, and we are going to go to Ms. Sasha Ricard for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Great. So the first thing I want to say is to the resolution is that extreme views are helpful or contribute to education on campus. And I want to focus on the extreme part of that and the education part of that first, which is, and just to make the sort of general point that extremism has a way of making people shut down, has a way of making people not take seriously ideas that if they were presented in a more moderate way, they might really take seriously. Makes it easier to dismiss a position if it's presented in an extreme way. And so, I'm not sure this is sort of the core of the question that we want to talk about in the debate, but I did want to just bring out this idea that actually having someone like Milo Yiannopoulos or one of these sort of provocateurs come to campus and give a polemical version of some position, actually, I'm inclined to think is counterproductive to getting people to actually take that position seriously and be able to talk about it in a way that is productive of real learning. So that's the first point I wanted to say, to make. The second point that I wanted to make is that an educational institution has a particular project, right? Like the university is there to take young people, teach them certain things and make them ready to be, adults and leaders for the future. And there are some ideas that get in the way of that. If you sort of are suggesting to people, for example, that there is no truth, if you are in the middle of an economics class raising your hand every 5 seconds to say, well, but can we really know, like, is money a real thing? Like, is economics really a real field? There are some kinds of extremism that are just counterproductive, and they take up space. That's sort of obviously a silly point, but they take up space in the discourse and distract from really serious points in a way that I think can be really harmful. The way that a lot of disinformation works is not exactly that it's it's not violent or oppressive in any way exactly, but it distracts, right? People say these crazy things that make you question what otherwise were the bounds of ordinary discourse and what we ordinarily took to be reality, in a way that takes away time that could otherwise be spent really clarifying what we already basically agree is right. So that's a second point, that it distracts from the purpose of the university if you allow really extreme beliefs, conspiracy theories, that sort of thing. So that's the second point that I wanted to make. But I think probably the most important thing I want to say is that there's a time and a place for questions that have really serious personal and political implications. And I'm not sure that time and place is, big impersonal public speeches on campus or classrooms. I teach political theory. I study ancient Greece. Like, I'm all for having like really radical questioning. I'm not sure democracy is always the best form of regime. I have lots of conversations with my friends, with my professors about the role of women in society and what it means to have equality between the genders. But those are questions that have pretty serious implications for individuals. And I think that they need to be taken on with great care.
You could come to your last sentence.
Oh, sure. And that we should really take seriously the idea that we have a responsibility to think about who is giving those messages, how they're being given, and in what circumstances. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to go to a question from Mr. Figueroa. If you'd unmute and ask your question to me.
Okay, there we go. Yes, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd just like to say I appreciate both speakers. I think they were very reasoned and well balanced, and I appreciate their synopses. I wanted to ask the last speaker. I wanted to ask her, given the fact that we have such vagaries around extremism, who is to determine what's extreme or not, and given the controversy that we have at different campuses, and there is no standard, for example, that I know of, that a university uses to determine what is allowed and what is not allowed. It's kind of up to each one, and in some ways that's good, but on the other hand, the standard might be helpful. So I wanted to ask the speaker if she thought that there might be some criteria or some process that might be a generally accepted standard that could be used across universities. And if so, what would that consist of?
Great. Thank you for that. Ms. Ricard, you have up to 1 minute to answer.
Thank you. Yeah, the questioner asks a really great question. I think it's really, really hard to have a consistent standard. I'm inclined to say, I think it would be great if there were some simple thing you could say, but I'm inclined to say we have a responsibility as individuals and as members of a community to take this on as a question that we have to confront in every circumstance, given the particulars of that circumstance. So I don't know that there is a clear standard.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ruffander, if you would unmute and ask your question to me.
Hello, thank you. So one of the things that I heard you mention, or
that she mentioned, yep.
Yeah, right out the gate was the polemical type of extremist views. And to me, I think there's a big difference between the polemical type of extremist views, or the type of extremist views that directly, deliberately call for violent action, and the kinds of things that you hear people, what I see being kind of unjustly, canceled from universities for what people will call like, well, they're basically doing this, and it's not basically that at all. Would you be more?
Would she be?
What? Oh, right. Would she be more inclined to support the exposure to extreme ideas if they weren't polemical, if they were backed up by reasonable amounts of research, and if there was an opposition figure who could challenge them rather than just having it be a one-sided, like, auditorium lecture type thing?
Great. Mr. Ricard, you have up to a minute to answer that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in general, yeah, absolutely. I think, like I said, there's a time and a place for extreme views, and particularly having them presented in the most reasonable way and with somebody who has an opportunity to respond to them is, I think, a better time and place. But that is, I think, a kind of moderation and a kind of limit that we really do need to impose. And that does mean there are some people and some kinds of speeches that we may really want to limit. So I think even putting that kind of limitation on it is, I think, to some people would seem restrictionist, but to me seems reasonable and even necessary.
Great, thank you. And with that, our speaker is thanked. I'm now looking for a speech in the affirmative, and we are going to go to Mr. Weisenfels.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, meeting someone who strongly and actively disagrees with something important to us can be confusing, upsetting, and frustrating. And when such people talk with students, we may be concerned that there is a risk that the students may start believing incorrect or harmful or outright destructive things. So why is it so important to expose students and people in general to conflicting or extreme ideas during their education, so that they can learn constructive ways to respond to those ideas? And most people hold some beliefs that conflict with other people's beliefs, and that's not going to change if we never meet anyone with beliefs different from our own. And we will meet them eventually, or at least we'll have to deal with the projects and policies that they support. And we have to communicate with them, negotiate with them, and sometimes persuade them to reconsider their beliefs. That becomes very difficult to do if we've never listened to what they have to say before. College is an excellent opportunity for people to learn about different ideas and beliefs. I do support the idea of spaces where everyone in the space accepts some starting assumptions so that they can get on with their business without interruption. But in general, we just need to make sure that in addition to mere exposure to ideas and beliefs, we're also providing the students with practice in understanding perspectives and opinions without necessarily agreeing with them. We must make sure that they know how to examine and develop their own perspectives through comparisons to the alternatives that they see. They must identify the underlying assumptions that they and others have, question those assumptions, and figure out how to get meaningful answers to those questions. And I found that this is the most effective path to deconstructing and refuting destructive ideas so that those who hold them reevaluate their own positions. On the flip side, many, if not most, of the social ideas that we currently take for granted as good were once considered extreme. And that obviously doesn't mean that every extreme idea is good, but it does mean that if we want to make the world better, we need to identify the pros and cons of different ideas and determine how constructive they are, even if they don't look like what we had in mind. Students can't learn how to do that if they only encounter familiar ideas. To benefit from exposure to diverse ideas, opinions, and beliefs, students must learn how to understand their own values, understand others' values, and frame the situation constructively. By listening to each other and describing as simply as possible what matters most, they can find zones of possible agreement, establish mutual understanding and trust, and firm boundaries, and collaborate towards ideas that are better than what anyone started out with. If we teach students how to do that, then we have nothing to fear and everything to gain from ensuring that everyone can speak somewhere. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Jazz hands for the speaker. And we're gonna go to our question. First question from Mr. I'm sorry, you're Adam. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The previous speaker raised several good points. I would like to quote an idea from the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who says that colleges can only have one primary goal, the pursuit of truth or the pursuit of justice. Does the previous speaker agree with that? And which does he, if so, which does he think should be the goal of a university?
Great, thank you so much. You have up to 1 minute to answer.
This is a good question. And to a certain extent, it depends on, well, I'd say universities are often for people to learn tangible skills, learn technical skills, to how to do science, mathematics, etc. But also we're introducing a dual purpose, which is learning how to navigate society. And insofar as we can compare truth and justice, truth really depends on what we value, because those are the facts that we look for, and those are the facts that we're willing to bet are true. So everything that we do to study the world, we study it because we care about it, and we care about the consequences if we're wrong. And justice is negotiating with each other about what we care about and what we want to do with the truths that we study. That's a really good question. I hope I did it justice, so to speak.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have another question for the speaker?
There's a Thomas Brandt with his hand up. I don't know if he can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much. Mr. Brandt, you can unmute and ask your question to me.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I just got a note in the chat. I might be allowed to make a longer speech, so I'll try to phrase this in the form of a question.
Okay.
I'm of the opinion that we need to almost make routine primers or tutorials in all kinds of venues in which ideas are exchanged about not just politics, but reality itself. Concepts from philosophy such as epistemology, how we know what we think we know, the limitations of the best methods we currently have for seeking truth, quote unquote, law, science, journalism, what they're based on, their assumptions, what their weaknesses are.
If you could come to your question.
Yes, I'd like to, I'll make that speech later, but ask the previous speaker if he thinks that kind of routinized or normalized tutorial before discussions between extreme views or even one-sided views would be a useful thing to be institutionalized in higher education for starters, and then in the internet world in particular after that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing your speech. Mr. Weissenfels, you have up to 1 minute to answer.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely believe that an epistemological framework would be very important for people to have before they get exposed to all sorts of different ideas, because then they have a way to approach them. This ties back in with the previous question as well, because in our search for truth, we need to understand what we care about and what we also fear will happen if we search for truth and we believe something and then we turn out to be wrong, because that influences what we're willing to believe in the first place. And so that way, not only do we understand why we believe what we believe, but also why other people believe those things. And we can get down below the belief level and just look at what do we want and what can we tell from the world around us, and how can we use that to maybe get what we all want. So it's epistemology, I find, helps discussions be very constructive.
Great, thank you so much. With that, our speaker is thanked, and we'll be going to a speech in the negative from Mr. Ethan Abelman.
Sorry, I was muted. I don't think I was one of the original 4 speakers.
You are our next negative speaker, if that works for you.
Oh, okay. You didn't have enough negative speakers to start?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and give your speech.
Okay, well, I don't have a speech prepared, but I'll try and be as succinct as possible. I guess I'm more on the negative side, but I find, like many Braver Angels debate questions, the phrasing of the question to be kind of weird. As we've discussed already, extremism, what does that even mean, right? So what I'll discuss is what I think is a line for me as to what I think is appropriate on a given on a college campus or on any sort of similar educational institution, and I'll explain it by telling an anecdote from that was very salient for me in high school. Actually, we had we're in a very liberal area, and we had a conservative speaker come, and I was, as someone, as I'm sure many of you guys are here, I was kind of excited to sort of hear. It's basically, it was pitched as like, all about conservatism and what it means and what the principles are. And I was interested. And the speaker went on to sort of talk about why he believed that gay marriage should not be legal. And he talked about, he sort of gave this very, high-level argument about the majority of Americans don't, at that time, the majority of Americans don't support it. It's not something that the government should mandate, blah, blah, blah. And I was with him. I got it. And then one of my friends who is gay, there was this question and answer session, and he stood up and he asked something to the effect of, so just because the majority of Americans don't think it should be allowed, I should be denied the dignity of living the life the way I want and denied the government benefits? And he said, yeah. And at that moment, the learning stopped. Because there was an element of, because basically the person we were supposed to learn from dehumanized the person who's supposed to be learning from them. And I think that's a difficult line to define sometimes, but that is the concern that I have when I think about what constitutes as allowed, or sort of allowed types of extremism, whatever that means. I think that if a university is to invite someone who has the explicit expressed belief that some humans are worse than other humans, or that some humans are their way of living or their autonomy or things like that is denigrated, I don't think that's productive to have them on campus. There's no learning to happen. And so that is sort of the line for me. And it's not always a simple line to draw, I think, but another example is just, if I think about, for example, as a Jew, it was very visceral hearing the Jews will not replace us chants at Charlottesville. And I can't imagine being in favor of someone coming to speak at an educational institution of mine who harbored that view and having that be at all a productive conversation. So curious to hear your thoughts, and thanks for listening.
Great, thank you so much. A round of jazz hands for our speaker. We're now going to go to a question from Mr. McCamey. If you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if the speaker would feel like there might be more productive conversation if that the speaker he referred to denying benefits to gays and so on had been further challenged by other people in the audience, or if in fact, like another speaker referred to, there had been an alternate speaker to flesh out this person's views and frankly expose them as somewhat fallacious. A corollary to my question would be, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, would the speaker have concerns that if this person were banned from campus, their views would not go away, they just wouldn't be heard on the campus, but they would go underground as a prior speaker referred to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. You have up to 1 minute to answer, Mr. Abelman.
I think there's a few things there regarding the going underground. I think I think that would that's definitely a consequence, but I don't necessarily think that a place like a college campus is necessarily where that voice should be heard. There are other platforms, and I don't think it's worth it if the message that that institution sends is student, I'm going to invite this person who thinks you're a worse human being. Can the questioner remind me of the first part of their question?
Sure, Mr. McCamey, you can repeat the first part.
Certainly, I was just I was wondering, Mr. Chair, if the speaker thought that if the speaker had been further challenged at the presentation regarding denying benefits to gays and so on, if they'd been challenged further by other audience members or maybe even an alternate speaker, that their views could have been well fleshed out rather than just let this person speak unchallenged.
Great, thank you for the reminder. Go ahead.
So I guess let me say this. I think that to the extent that those discussions can happen, they're really productive and really good. It's the reason we're all here, right? We want to be able to flesh out these difficult issues. But the question that I asked myself, and so like I'm thinking like back in that moment in high school, I bet I would have gotten some benefit from engaging in that as someone who's not gay. But the person sitting next to me has just been completely shut out from this discussion, and they're the person who this directly affects. And there is no, I don't think there's a productive conversation for them to have because they've just been dehumanized. So anyway, it's tricky. I think I have a lot of respect for the people who are willing to take those difficult leaps. I think about, like, for example, like there's some famous Black folks who have sort of engaged with the Ku Klux Klan and things like that. And I think that's like really awesome, but I don't think it's a reasonable expectation that we should have for someone to have have that conversation.
Great. We're going to do one more question for you from Mr. David Hunter, if you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
Hello, Mr. Chair. So as I understand the speaker's discussion, I feel like his experience, in fact, had the speaker that was trying to be against gay marriage convince at least one student that gay marriage, in fact, should be allowed and is a good thing. I feel like this supports what Jonathan Rauch argued in the Constitution of Knowledge, that allowing to speak on campuses, in fact, brings a discussion into the open and allows it to be resolved. I'd like to know if the speaker has any comments on this, rebuttals, or anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Abelman, you have up to 1 minute to answer that.
I think my point is that if that discussion had not been about gay marriage and sort of in the underbelly being about the dignity of certain humans, if it had been about why conservatives think that smaller government and lower taxes are the right way, and there was a very heated discussion and just like heated debate, maybe even some zingers thrown or whatever, I think that's awesome, really do. But I don't think my friend needed their opinion, their beliefs clarified. I don't think I need someone to come and tell me that I should be replaced. And so,
If you come to the last sentence of your answer.
yeah, I mean, I think that's where I draw the line. And I'll just say I think it's a difficult line to draw, but that's sort of where I'm at.
Great. Thank you so much. With that, our speaker is thanked. And we are going to go to a speech in the affirmative from Mr. John Sheeman.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Chairman. I'm a retired professor of pediatrics and now practicing telemedicine. I was president of my state conference of the American Association of University Professors until my tenure was canceled and I was dismissed by an administration defying the principles of academic freedom. Now, all universities have pledged to follow those principles. Academic expertise must determine qualifications and positions. In medicine, that means that academic position must be determined by expertise, not popularity or profitability, as existed before the last century when an era of apprenticeship prevailed. We are backsliding now considerably. With respect to the current topic, the role of the college campus is to provide expert guidance to the student who must be exposed to and evaluate the broad variety of ideas available. This is the same role for schools for younger students, to the extent that they can comprehend such material. That exposure at every level must be determined by those whose training and expertise is recognized, not the political influence of either parents' movements, politicians, or administrators catering to financial interests. The attempts to remove critical race theory from education is a perfect recent negative example. Schools are being instructed by politicians not to present material that might make students feel guilty about the questionable background and unintentionally unequal structure of current society. A very public example of the attempt of a college to interfere with that process occurred a year ago, in which the author of the 1619 project, Hannah Nicole Jones, was denied tenure at University of North Carolina. And I quote from the AAUP. On behalf of the AAUP, we join faculty members and others across the country in condemning in the strongest possible terms the decision by the Board of Trustees of the UNC to ignore the strong recommendation of the university's journalism faculty to award tenure to Nicole Hannah Jones, appointed as Knight Chair in Race and Investigative Journalism. Arbitrary governing board intervention in an individual faculty hiring decision is almost always a gross violation of the principles of shared governance and academic freedom. They backed down, but Dr. Jones went elsewhere. In summary, I agree that it is resolved exposure to extreme views contributes to education on campus. In fact, all education is the competitive evaluation of diverse views, not just learning the correct view. However, a note of caution: the more extreme the ideas and beliefs that are presented, the greater the need for concomitant expert guidance of the student. Thus, a forum for such extreme ideas should always be accompanied by objective evaluation by recognized expertise. There is never a place for false equivalency, whereby equal time must always be given to both recognized expertise and a crackpot conspiracy theory or science fiction position. True, peer review is the most effective determinant of expertise. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. A round of jazz hands for our speaker. We're going to go to our first question. Mr. Roughander, if you would unmute and ask your question to me.
Yeah, thank you. So my question for the speaker is, does he see? Yeah,
you got it. Great.
Does he see a difference in like how we ought to manage extreme views on campuses between a person coming and lecturing in an auditorium for like a night and hiring a faculty member with extreme views? Because I can see how it would be a different thing to hire somebody like Milo, I can't pronounce his last name, Yanam Papadopoulos, whatever, and somebody who teaches critical race theory versus just having them speak for an evening. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Mr. Sheeman, you have up to 1 minute to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The questioner rightly noted that there's a difference between making a major commitment at a university to arranging a speech, but the speeches that are provided to the campus on total should be expertisely moderated by the faculty. That is the role of the faculty. So whether it be a single speech or whether it be a hiring, those are the role of the experts. And given that the expertise should be available on campus, then the presentation should not be a simple rant by somebody in an extreme idea, but in fact a forum in which the opportunity for expert faculty to comment at the time would make that a lot more understandable to the students. And in fact, it's the way it should happen.
Great, thank you. We now go to another question from, your name is a little bit cut off, but I believe it's Professor Falk. F.A., yeah, I'm not totally sure, but if you'd unmute and ask your question to me.
It's not cut off, it's pro, my position.
Oh, I see.
And very good points made by the questioners and the speaker, but I'd like to ask the speaker whether he would believe that the faculty would offer or could offer an unbiased decision as to which speakers should or should not be brought to campus. From the last couple of years, it's looked to me that they have been very biased, as have the students. But the other really, I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, I'll get back to it. But that'll do for now. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Sheeman, you have up to 1 minute to answer.
Well, thank you for that observation and your opinion that
his opinion. Yep. Sorry.
His opinion is that in many cases the faculty does not correctly decide whether something is extreme or not, but the expertise is in fact invested within the faculty. That's what the tenure system involves. And so if in fact the faculty is completely wrong in its judgment, at least this should be an open forum to make that decision rather than your opinion or somebody else's opinion that the faculty was wrong.
Great, thank you so much. With that, our speaker is thanked. Big round of jazz hands. Yep. All right. So we are now going to go to a speech in the negative from Miss April Cornfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's fun for me not to be chairing tonight because it means I get to speak. And I the first thing there have been a number of really excellent points made. The first thing I want to say though is that obviously it is great to have people be exposed to differing views, to like learn how to interact with people who are different from them. All of that is great, but let's not pretend that that doesn't come with a cost. And I think that it's easy to believe that we just need people to like talk to each other and then we'll have a good society. But I would argue that it's easy for powerful people to advocate that, and that many other people who are not as powerful don't tend to advocate it as often. And that beliefs can really, I think I don't support federal, like legal regulation of beliefs, but I do support social shunning of certain beliefs because I think that there are some beliefs that lead to violence. And so for an example, I spent 10 years working on a sexual assault hotline, and I'm going to use the example of rape culture. And forgive me, I know this is a little heavy, but I'd like to start with a belief that I think a lot of people actually learned in college and found reiterated in college, which is that boys will be boys. And I would argue that so we all were surprised by Me Too a few years ago, but what was really noteworthy about Me Too wasn't that people were willing to say things on social media, it was that so many people had been silent before. And so I think that silence is so rape culture lives in lots and lots of little signals and views and indications and just sort of cultural nooks and crannies where our beliefs actually show up, and they facilitate situations where people are in a lot of trouble and are not in a good position to do anything about it. So I think that enough sexual violence survivors believe that they will face major negative consequences in their own lives if they speak up, that they just stay silent until there's something like Me Too, until there's something that shows that there's a lot of social support. And so my essential argument is that that some speech shuts down other speech, and that therefore this is messy and not easy. And I would say that sometimes extreme views contribute to education, but education for whom? I don't think it's the case that if we just let speech happen without accounting for power, that we will get the access to the truth that we want. I really liked the questioner who brought up, or the question that was brought up about Jonathan Haidt's assertion that a university can pursue either justice or truth, but not both. I think that that justice is part of the truth, right? If we're not pursuing justice as a way to get to what is true, then we're missing parts of the truth that are essential to our creating a good society, to our being good people. And so I guess I would also, although I wholeheartedly respect the tenure system, experts aren't going to solve this for us. They haven't for most of the history of universities, right? Like, just so to me, I would say that yeah, I support exposure to extreme views in some ways. I think that people need to be able to be prepared to see what's going to happen to them in the real world. But there are different degrees. And I think that there's that whole quote, right, that free lunches aren't free. I think free speech is not free, and that we pretend that it is at our peril. So with that, I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much. Big round of jazz hands. All right, we were going to start with a question from Mr. Brantley. If you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. A lot of the discussion is focused on what is extreme, and I'd like to ask the speaker if she thinks that a distinction between an extreme view and one that is intellectually worthy is a good distinction.
Okay, Ms. Cornfield, you have up to 1 minute to answer.
Sure. I think that there are extreme views that are intellectually worthy, and there are views that fall into one category or the other, but not both. I also think that, so there's this question that comes up as an argument in favor of free speech, which is who decides, but that at the end of the day, society does decide this, right? We do generally say that you can't be a Holocaust denier and it's fine. And so it's not that I think there's a great answer to which views are intellectually worthy, which views are extreme, who gets to decide all that, but we're going to make a decision one way or the other. And so I think it's important to try to make sure that we make that we set ourselves up to make a right one. And that means understanding that free speech, that speech is not all, we can't let everyone, if we just like open the playing field, that is not enough to get access to all the truths everybody has.
Great, thank you. Ms. Hampson, you'll be our next questioner if you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, hi. So my point isn't directly about what April said, but it was regarding what was said earlier, if that's okay.
Okay, so if you want to give a speech addressing that, that would be fantastic. But right now we're just going to take questions for
about what
Ms.
April
Cornfield.
said. Okay.
Yes. All right, so let's go to Mr. Weisenfels, if you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
Yes, thank you. So I've learned from the previous speakers in the negative that it is a major concern that by having people speak about certain things, people may fear being forced to justify what they consider to be their rights and dignity to varying degrees, and that we may want to avoid speakers who may turn public opinion against a group or which provoke feelings of defensiveness. So I'm wondering, do we think that there may be a way to address this in some other way while while still maintaining a platform for people who may somehow legitimately believe these things? Is there a way that we could set it up so that we could address those and reduce that threat while still having those ideas expressed? Thank you.
It's a great question. I think that this is unfortunately a case where there are competing goods. I actually think most cases are cases where there are competing goods. And so, yes, I mean, we can find ways to work it, and we do in general. That my point is not that we should necessarily restrict speech in particular ways, although I could speak to the ways that I think we should and shouldn't. Most importantly, government shouldn't do it, society should. And that includes institutions, which can include campuses. But I think that the point is that because you're going to lose some truth if you set things up such that their power is not accounted for, you need to compensate for that. And so I'm not arguing that, and frankly, I probably shouldn't say this on record, but I think Holocaust denial should be something that is allowed in a free society. But I do think that we should shun it. And I do think that it has genuine psychological impacts on a lot of people. And I just want it to be, I don't think that we should censor dehumanizing speech from the government, but I think that we should understand that it genuinely damages the people on the other side of it, and work with that, cope with that, make moves to address that as part of building the society that we want.
Great. And with that, the speaker is thanked. One more round of jazz hands for Ms. Cornfield. We are now going to go to a speech in the affirmative from Alden Didero.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I work for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We've been defending student and faculty rights for the past 20 years. And we believe that free speech is essential to democracy, scientific progress, artistic expression, social justice, peace, and the ability to live as authentic individuals. I think the resolution begs the question, what is the purpose of a university? For me, I think that should be to prepare students for the rest of their lives by teaching them to think for themselves. Not teaching them what to think, but teaching them how to think. This is critical thinking. I think everybody knows what critical thinking is. But I think a lot of universities aren't concerned with that, but they ought to be concerned with that. And when you create an environment that discourages free thought, it encourages conformity. Critical thinking is a skill that allows us to be productive members of society, democracy, and the workplace. As our CEO, FIRE's CEO, and President Greg Lukianoff, and famous social psychologist who has also been mentioned, Jonathan Haidt, wrote in their 2017 Atlantic piece, college campuses today have a culture of vindictive protectiveness. This means that everyone has a duty to protect vulnerable groups from hearing ideas or words that may be uncomfortable, and to punish those who disturb this. But this causes people to get stuck in patterns that lead them to anxiety and depression. It pushes them into echo chambers, and it cripples them from engaging with fellow citizens who see things differently. And this is detrimental to our nation's ability to build a house united. Disinviting speakers or shutting down extreme unpopular points of view contributes to the lack of critical thought that we see on campuses today. By not allowing students to engage with worldviews that conflict with their own, they are taught what to think and not how to think. Also, they are taught that some things are too horrible to hear, and you're doing the opposite of teaching them how to stand up for themselves when you censor that. FIRE believes that it's not only someone's right to say something unpopular, but it's also your right to stand up and say, that's why it's wrong. Today, speakers, politicians, authors, and even comedians now are refusing to come on colleges' campuses in the fear that they will be shut down or canceled. And people with mainstream conservative views are now seen as extremists due to our increasingly polarized society. And shutting down unpopular opinions does not make the world a better place. And it can absolutely solidify hate. And it does a disservice to people by not allowing them to learn something in the process of engaging extreme or unpopular beliefs. Freedom of speech and academic freedom depends on our ability to handle hearing opinions we dislike and to engage those opinions constructively and creatively. And I know we talked about some things that like standards being set, but the standard should be the First Amendment to the Constitution. That's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A big round of jazz hands for our speaker. And for our first question, we're going to go to Ms. Tampson. If you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
Okay. So my question to Alden is, I think I really like the point that he raised regarding freedom of expression. And it made me think about how there's a difference perhaps in opinion versus facts. And that brought me back to what April was saying regarding the Holocaust, because in my mind, that's a factual piece of evidence, right? But if we take something extreme like, or something that could be more polarized, even if we think about gun control or abortion or even the war in Gaza and Israel, right? Those are like opinions still at the moment versus something is a bit more factual. And I think like in a case where something is factual, like the Holocaust, I do think you should still present students with like the ability to be like, this is fake news, you know, and still engage in some sort of critical understanding so they themselves can learn to understand when something is not true versus
And your question for Mr. Alden.
Oh, so my question for Mr. Alden, sorry, I'm new at this, so apologies.
That's okay. That's okay. You're doing great.
Is I guess I just would like to hear your thoughts on what I just said.
Go ahead.
Absolutely.
You have up to 2 minutes to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will say that I am also new at this. This is my first time here. So, but to your point about what I was saying in terms of
point.
To her point. My apologies, Mr. Chair. To the point. Absolutely, these like opinions and facts are definitely something we should be differentiating between. But also, I think that she made a point that I had made already, that, you know, it's important for people to engage with these opinions and or, you know, disseminating facts that are easy actually to kind of defend. And by not allowing people to defend those obviously wrong or right points of view, you're robbing students or people just on campus in general of, one, strengthening their own arguments and strengthening their own critical thinking skills. So, yeah.
Great. And now we're going to go to Mr. Bushka for another question. If you'll unmute and direct your question to me. Mr. John Bushka, if you'd unmute and ask your question to me. Looks like I'll give you one more second. If not, we'll go to Mr. Abelman.
I didn't.
Oh, there we go. Go ahead.
Realize I hadn't unmuted. Yeah. How do you, Mr. Alden? Yeah. How do you feel about something?
How does he feel? Yes, ask your question to me.
How does he feel? Yeah, Mr. Speaker. How does he feel about something that is unusually sensitive when it deals with children? As you probably have heard, basically the controversy over gender. Critical gender theory in lower grades in schools as a topic. You know how polarizing that's been in recent weeks. And how do you feel about?
How does he feel?
How does he feel about something that is unusually sensitive because there is an unusually vulnerable group, in this case, children, who might be affected? How does he feel about that?
Great. Ellen, you have up to 1 minute to answer.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question, but I would also like to say, I think this debate, particularly in my expertise, are kind of within the college and the higher education kind of field. So I'd say in terms of stuff that is really pertaining to K through 12 and policies like that, that is usually left up to the state in terms of policies or what is brought into schools. And that's really not my particular place to speak on that. However, there are many cases where, especially in the court system, where precedents are applied to colleges that were actually should have been applied to K through 12, specifically the Tinker case. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but it has to do with harassment in terms of K through 12 stuff like that. And that has been applied to college cases in the past, and that actually has done a disservice to a lot of college campuses and their own policies. So in terms of that, really, universities should be only focused on the First Amendment because they are usually bound by it. And in terms of the gender equality stuff, that, like, as we talked about before, expression is also a part of speech. So that should also be, protected.
Great. With that, our speaker is thanked. Big round of jazz hands, and we're going to go to a speech in the negative from Miss Catherine Jansky. If you'll unmute.
Hello, hey everyone. Sorry, my heart is like beating out of my chest because
Take your time.
it is so, I just pinned the chair, so it's like I'm just talking to him. But the so I'm trans. This speech is going to start off pretty as a trans woman, but I do think that it is an important perspective to share. I thought of this speech when we were back talking about epistemology, and then it actually very nicely led into this moment. And that concept of like, how do we know what we know? And I would actually not consider this an extreme view, is that trans people don't exist. Trans people are, I am actually, counter to maybe what you thought when you first saw me. I'm actually a man, and that is purely based off of the very strict ideas of like how we know what gender is. And when you change how we know what we know to something else that, however you want to describe your feeling of gender, but at the very least that it doesn't come directly from biology, that becomes a place for where debate could happen. And within the bounds of accepting extreme views or even mildly not extreme views, I don't define it as extreme because many people feel this way, in my opinion, in this country. But that a view like that should still not be allowed on college campuses, specifically to keep it limited to college campuses, because as Ethan said earlier, this point about the people that you're trying to teach and talk to are being excluded by the very thing that you are arguing. And in my opinion, that benefits very strongly anyone who doesn't have to engage with the thing that's being debated. So take it away from trans issues, it just benefits people who have more power in a society. I believe Sasha may have said, someone said that, that the people who are gaining the most from this conversation might walk out and say, oh, wow, that really taught me a lot about why I don't think that trans people are, real people, or who they say they are, and should be treated as different than they say. That would not be that could be intellectually stimulating to someone who doesn't have to deal with the ramifications of that in their real life and in the classroom that they may be trying to learn that thing in. And I also want us to stop necessarily imagining a speaker coming in for a night or a professor holding a certain opinion, but what students are saying and what students are allowed to believe, and whether I'm allowed to use a certain bathroom, or whether when I walk into that bathroom, whether someone is allowed to throw verbal insults at me or, report me potentially to campus, or to like call campus security or something and face no ramifications for that action because it's an issue of speech or expression. And I believe that that's mostly what I wanted to say. How much time do I have? Do I have a second more?
You're good. You have one more second
Okay.
or two if you want to take it.
There is an op-ed that was written a long time ago, like 4 years ago, It was titled I Am Brett Kavanaugh. I didn't write it. And it was by this guy, it was during the Brett Kavanaugh trials, and it was by this guy who was really upset about this culture of sort of assuming that conservative beliefs are not true. And he ends a polemic with the line, it is ironic that a place dedicated to truth is hostile to skepticism. I think it was a wonderful thing that the Bowdoin Orient published his op-ed. He was torn to shreds. No one talked to him. And this is the kind of thing that, like, I think should be allowed and can be discussed, but that was in a very specific place. I could choose not to read the Orient that day. I was okay with that. It was fine. It wasn't a place that I was required to be anyway, a place where I needed to learn just to be able to exist in this society, to be able to be the successful person that I want to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Big round of jazz hands. And as we go to questions, we're going to start with a question from Ms. Cornfield. If you'd unmute and ask your question to me. You are muted if you'd unmute.
Man, yes, every time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say how much I admire the speaker who just spoke and her willingness to share. I think it's wonderful. And I believe, I think a lot of what she believes, I mean, actually what they believe, I'll do gender neutral pronouns for this.
I use she, her pronouns. Vibes.
You do, okay, cool. Yeah, okay, so what she believes. My question, so I want to very gently push her on this, because knowing that I believe this, I also have, I can't figure out how we do provide a space for like persuasion and for people coming to learn the stories of people who are different from them, and also protect the people who need protecting. And so my question is just, does she have any thoughts on how we do that? And knowing that, like, I totally admire what she's saying and the fact that she was willing to speak.
Great. You have up to 1 minute to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate that question. And I believe that it was the questioner who said that thing that I misattributed to Sasha earlier. But Sasha did say something very important that I'm going to bring in now, which is that there is a time and a place. And for me, I'm not afraid to engage in these kinds of things. I went canvassing during the 2020 election in Maine, Purple State, and I engaged with a lot of people who either could tell I was trans or sometimes couldn't, and then later found out. And it was this like, aha, gotcha moment for them, because they were just spewing all this shit. And spewing a lot of stuff that I would normally reject and say, you can't say that. You can't say that, especially if it were in a classroom. There's one guy in particular that I remember who, once I told him I was trans, he sort of, this like expression came over his face. And he was like, oh, I'm so sorry, you know, I don't really think about that. And, you know, he was very flustered. And he told me a story about how his, well, you know what, the story is less relevant, but the point is I engaged with a conversation with this guy for like an hour, and the first half hour was not happy for me, but I thought it was important to change that opinion. I was canvassing. He knew I was, and I was there to talk about politics. And we had a great discussion where by the end, I think he definitely still voted for Trump. And I'm pretty sure that he still felt that trans people were not who they say they are, but had more respect and more kindness. And I certainly felt more respect and kindness regarding the top subject that we talked about. I was campaigning for like Democrats, is why I mentioned the Trump thing. So like I didn't accomplish anything except the like gaining of respect that came from it being like a mutually agreed upon, okay, we're both okay with talking about this in this space, not being forced one on the other.
Great, we'll do, thank you. We'll do one more question from Miss Michelle Polino. If you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
Oh, hi, Mr. Chair. I really wanted to refine, I wanted her to refine exactly what she's saying. I believe I heard that, that there's a time and a place. And what she's saying is college campuses are not the time and place. if you can just refine that for me.
If she could, yes.
Yes, please. Yes, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Great.
Yes, exactly. And I think that it would be hard to go down the laundry list of like things you can't talk about on college campuses. That's just one that's near and dear to me, that I feel there are certain things that should not be up for debate because it removes people who are kind of required to be there anyway. I need an education, and I need to pass my class and things like that. So yeah, that's how I feel it. That's also why I feel college campuses are not the place to debate the validity of the existence of people and the experiences that they've had.
Great. And with that, our speaker is thanked. Big round of jazz hands. We are just a little more than over halfway through our debate tonight, and we're going to switch to 3-minute speeches. We have a number of people who still want to speak on both sides of our resolution. So I'm going to go to a speech in the affirmative from Miss Julia Olszewski, and you'll have up to 3 minutes for your speech. Go ahead and unmute and start when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is my first Braver Angels Zoom call, so I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm also very excited to be here. Yeah, so I'll be speaking in the affirmative. I feel like this topic of discussion is kind of like a microcosm of Braver Angels itself, as this group of people really aims to look at where do we talk about the difficult questions that we are faced with in society, and how do we do that in a respectful and civil way. I was introduced to Braver Angels through Monica Guzman's book that she recently wrote and published. And I really learned a whole lot about what that means to have, and engage with difficult and sometimes very hurtful concepts and beliefs. And I think what it comes down to is college and universities, in my opinion, are meant for education and for the broadening of minds. Not everyone is meant to go to university or college. There's trade school, there's career paths that don't require higher education. And I do believe that people who have a desire for higher education are there for a reason. And that is why I do believe that it is important that those difficult conversations are had in university campuses, because at the end of the day, when we're learning from one another and we're having the conversations and we're listening, we do have to have the time and place, but it is a growing experience. It is a learning experience. And I think that all learning essentially comes down to listening to hard things. I didn't like learning my multiplication tables when I was in elementary school, but I still had to learn them. Of course, I'm not going to equate that to, listening to, someone speak about genocidal tendencies, but it sometimes we have to learn and we have to listen to hard things. And I think if we go through our life expecting to only hear the easy and, the easy things to hear, living in echo chambers and residing in those echo chambers to the point where we just, become numb to any other criticisms, that's when we have failed ourselves and I think the people around us.
Great, thank you so much. Perfectly at 3 minutes. I'm now looking for a question for the speaker. I'm going to go to Miss Cornfield, if you'd unmute and ask your question to me.
I unmuted this time, and also other people should ask questions. I just get excited. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, a lovely, lovely speech. I'm wondering how the speaker thinks that we can. She's making wonderful points, and I'm wondering, it's essentially the same question as I asked the prior speaker in a way, like, how do we actually deal with the fact that some speech can shut down other people, that like, how do we, because what she's saying is so important, and yet there are this seems like it can also cause some problems. So how has she seen that happen well? What would she recommend?
Great. You have up to a minute to answer.
I mean, I think I'll just reiterate the same answer that a lot of people have been saying. There's a time and a place. I don't have a very stable opinion on whether or not people who have extreme views should be allowed onto campuses, but I do believe that just educating people to be more I think have more emotional intelligence. I think emotional intelligence in terms of having difficult conversations is extremely important, because if you don't have emotional intelligence, you're not able to pick up on when someone is, kind of closing up and saying, I don't really want to have this conversation anymore. Reading those body language, cues is very, very important in conversation. And at the end of the day, I do think it's very important to have conversation and not, like we've spoken about, oh, we're just going to be talked at. We're not going to have that conversation, because when you get, when you're just being talked at, it's very easy to just sort of start internalizing ideas and not really, being able to work through those out loud.
Great. We're going to do one more question from Miss La Rivereri. If you'd unmute and ask your question to me.
I found your presentation, Mr. Chair, the presentation was so moving. It was inspirational, I thought. But I have a question, and it kind of bleeds over into some of the other speakers. Okay. And it has to do with the tension between protecting the listeners and who we allow to speak. I was just thinking about Rosa Parks. And in her day, she was an expert on something, but she was not, as far as I know, highly educated. Do we protect people from her speech? Do we protect her from their speech? Her voice would be so valuable, but it's so hard. So I just wondered if the speaker had any thoughts on this idea of protection and how to handle that on a college campus.
Great. You have up to 1 minute to answer.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question. I'm not sure I have a very cut and dry answer, but I would say that, I think if you're having, a conversation, that's open to, about a conversation allowing, students to be talking about something that is controversial or that is, somewhat hurtful to others, I do think, and if you're having that in a public sense, I think it's important to, as I've seen a lot in a lot of media lately, of, having a disclaimer of, if you're entering this room, you and this is, speaking in the controlled sense of, this is a controlled conversation. Of course, you can't really have a disclaimer before you get into a conversation one-on-one and say, I'm going to be saying some very, radical things. But yeah, I providing those disclaimers, if it is in a public sense, I guess is what I mean to say.
Thank you. And with that, our speaker is thanked. A big round of jazz hands. And now we're going to go to a 3-minute speech in the negative from Miss Leah Sargent, if you'd unmute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think to an extent, we're debating over kind of a narrow range of outcomes, because everyone who showed up for a debate is clearly all right with confronting people who disagree with them. As several speakers have said, the question isn't about whether this is valuable ever. It's a question about what is the proper time and place and context for doing this fruitfully. And I really appreciated the speaker preceding me, the lady who said that part of what you do at school is you do things that are hard with the support of teachers, of curriculum, so that you're able to do a hard thing you might not do somewhere else. And I agree with that. But I do want to argue and put myself in the neg, because I think confronting extreme views is only a very tiny part of what schools are for. And there's a danger of kind of being blackmailed almost by the appeals to free speech and free expression and academic freedom into letting that one hard thing take up too much space relative to the hard things schools are actually for. Because schools are not free marketplaces of ideas. They can't be, and they shouldn't be. 4 years in college is not enough time to sort through every single plausible, interesting, wrong idea and discard it from first principles. Students come in to see professors to be part of a particular institution rather than simply to explore with their peers, because they hopefully have some degree of trust that the school they're entering is a better guide to what is true and how to recognize it than mere autodidactism would be. And that means schools can and should fess up to the fact that they believe some ideas to be true and some ideas to be false. And that to a certain extent, they should measure the success of their education by getting more students to believe things that are true. That doesn't mean it's not worth encountering or examining ideas that the school believes to be false. I've really benefited from learning a lot about Fred Hoyle's steady state model of the universe in contrast to the Big Bang, and kind of examining how does this kind of controversy arise between different people in good faith working with similar evidence who disagree, and then perhaps get stuck in that disagreement and can't jar loose even when more evidence comes in. But one only needs so many examples of false ideas to turn over. And there are simply more false ideas, even more compelling false ideas, than anyone has time for in a college education. So when we say, what is the time and the place? I think a school should make space for students to make mistakes in terms of who they invite to campus sometimes, make mistakes in terms of some of their interpersonal interactions, make mistakes in terms of some of their youthful ideological commitments. But should be clear that the goal is to learn that they are mistakes and then to stop making them. A college senior should make different choices about who they might invite or feel fruitful to bring to campus or engage in dialogue with than a freshman. And they should actually wind up with a narrower idea of what kind of wrong ideas are worth giving the spotlight to and what truths they really want the time and space to pursue fruitfully. Mr. Chair, I yield to questions.
Thank you so much. Big round of jazz hands. And we're going to go to Robin L. for our first question. If you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
So most of the speakers that have talked so far, when we're discussing examples of extreme views, have talked about Ku Klux Klan, Holocaust deniers, etc. Many ideas that are widely accepted today, like having a 40-hour work week, were once considered extreme. If people are never, especially if young people are never exposed to some of these quote unquote extreme ideas that are more humanistic, how does society get to change over time?
I think it's a mistake to think that only college or only formal instruction or even speakers at a college campus are the ways students are exposed to these ideas. It doesn't mean that I'm opposed to people seeking them out or making the case for them. I love debate and I like making my case for strong, possibly extreme views, like colleges should inculcate character and admit that they do that, since they already do, and make deliberate choices about it rather than say, oh, we welcome all ideas and all people. And that in itself is, I think, both a thing that is obviously true that they do, but won't fess up to. So very extreme if I were to say it in a college board meeting. But I don't think it's the case that it's always productive to sidetrack academic inquiry or a particular discipline of study with every interesting idea that might challenge the theory there. To some extent, you have to become a disciple of the method you want to critique in order to gain the stature to critique it.
Thank you. We'll do one more question from Mr. Gabarachi. If you'll unmute and ask your question to me, you're still muted.
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask you, speaker, what if when professors, they are misinforming and not telling the truth, and it happened to me when I was at campus, and then professors, it was just misinforming, just a bunch of students, and I stood up and because I knew about the subject very well, and I end up going to ombudsman, and so that's how I finished that class. What do you think, with misinforming and yeah.
Yeah, I think many professors don't teach things that are true. Either they're in a kind of intensely empirical discipline and they've fallen behind on the current research. So without any intent to mislead, they wind up leaving their students feeling well educated with huge gaps in their knowledge. And it's worth pointing that out where relevant. I think many professors in the humanities teach things that aren't true because they start from a false account of what it means to be human. And you can only get so far from that point. How much good it does for a student to confront the professor or go to the administration really depends on how strong the receipts are that by the university's own light, this professor is teaching something the university as a whole considers to be false. If it's something the university doesn't consider to be false, then it is more of a grassroots effort to convince other students that you're right, to convince other people in the field that you're right, and then eventually to have enough people who believe that you're right that you kind of pull off this Kuhnian revolution in your field and say, all of the old practitioners are wrong. We're not going to give anyone else tenure who holds those views. And now our field will advance. And that is the way a lot of disciplines advance. It's not by convincing everyone, it's by kind of a revolution in who gets hired. And it's not a totally reliable way of seeking truth, to be clear.
And with that, our speaker is thanked. One more round of jazz hands from Ms. Sargent. And now we're going to go to an affirmative speech, a 3-minute affirmative speech from Curtis Bleakley. If you'll unmute and go ahead.
Hi. I'd like to preface by saying I'm going to be starting college in like 11 days, so this is important. So I think the reason the reason behind my stance why I countenance supporting like even like having extreme speakers or that sort of thing at school is because it's like I think it is wise to expose yourself to another side of an argument in order to counter that side of an argument. And also like, I think it epitomizes regarding like the strength of the human spirit. So to preface, my school, there's a lot of like, essentially it's a lot of like book reading and like discussing of said books, going back like of the books going back like various centuries, like to like ancient Greece and like so forth. And like in a science class in particular, we learn initially about people believing like geocentrism and why they believe in this, and like like the logical thinking that came behind like these viewpoints and like why people believe that sort of thing. And later we turned to like reading about people who believe in like heliocentrism. And in other words, how like ideas change over time, and like how sometimes it's acceptable to have certain views versus other views. And this might seem like an archaic point, but like if we think about it in terms of like COVID or something like that, for example, like an anti-mask, like anti-vaccine like speaker comes to my school to give like an address, I'd be happy to like listen to them. I wouldn't agree with their viewpoints, but I think they have the right to disseminate their views, and we have the right to learn about that and expose ourselves to that, because you can more easily counter the viewpoints of something you disagree with by exposing yourself to those views, which is something that I think that my college in general is very good at, even beyond the bounds of extreme views. Like we exposing yourself to views that aren't inherently your own is like important, like in general. And I want to tie it back briefly to the truth and justice quote by Jonathan Haidt that was brought up earlier that I thought was really good. I think the idea of truth can only be reached once you're exposed to an idea and like the entirety of its facets, and not just like your interpretation of an idea. And it could include like the antithesis of your viewpoint, even if that idea is like vile. And the idea of this in cases like this can only be reached if at least a good number of views that are held or disseminated are given an opportunity to be aired, and again, even if those ideas may be abhorrent or something. Thanks for me to speak. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. Big round of jazz hands. And we're going to go to our first question from Mr. Abelman, if you'll unmute and ask a question to me.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I want to wish them the best of luck in college, because it's usually a blast. Hopefully. Anyway, I'm wondering I'm wondering if the speaker could speak to some of the concerns raised by some of the speeches in the negative. And specifically, I'm wondering if the speaker is concerned at all about types of speech that could potentially be dehumanizing to students, or types of speech that could sort of perpetuate a power imbalance that disempowers a student.
Thank you. Mr. Blakely, you have up to 1 minute to answer.
Yeah, with regards to I think that's a good question. And like I am concerned in that regards, because it could be like something that's like psychologically debilitating, or as you said, dehumanizing, like to be exposed to some views like this. I think it's always noted that there is an option to like avoid attending the event that this person who has like these abhorrent ideas are speaking at. So you can avoid that sort of dehumanizing effect upon you, which is a good thing. If like for some reason I'm not sure if this is feasible, but if for some reason like you aren't unable to avoid attending it, I think it is noteworthy, as like someone else suggested, having like a countering speaker that could like flesh out a different view and like allow for like maybe some way to redress the humanization aspect. I hope this makes sense. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Mr. Ruffander, if you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
Hello, hi Curtis. Thank you for your speech. Again, welcome to college. I hope you enjoy it. So I think one of the things that struck me about the speaker's speech is that you mentioned the belief in the human.
That he mentioned.
Oh, right. Sorry. That he mentioned the belief in the human spirit and the ability to counter an idea that you disagree with. I'm wondering how you think that.
How he thinks. Yeah.
How he thinks the willingness to embrace extreme views on campus, what he thinks that says about a person's belief or disbelief in the strength of the human spirit. Because it would seem as if you're very cynical about humanity, and in my instance, I believe that you have every right to be with things like the Holocaust. If you believe that people are too malleable, manipulatable, then they should be banned. Whereas if you believe that they are the kind of people who can withstand that and learn from it and become defenders of the truth. I don't know where I'm going with this exactly.
So yeah, your question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the question is basically, do you think cynicism? Does he think cynicism plays a role in a person's willingness to support freedom of exposure to extreme views?
Great. Thank you so much. Mr. Blakely, you have 1 minute.
Thank you for the question. Also very interesting. I think it does, because like if one possesses an entirely idealistic view of a certain topic, then that would make this person like unwilling to question that view because of a certain sense of idealism. But if you're cynical about a belief, that could make you more questioning of a viewpoint of a speaker, for example. And I think that makes you more resilient in the face of like abhorrent views being expressed. Like on the other hand, there is a good argument to be made that if one is like has a strong moral character, is like strongly an idealist, they could also like resist any attempts of like corruption or something like along those lines of their spirit by the strength of their idealism. So I think either position could be valid in this case. Thank you.
And with that, our speaker is thanked. Thank you so much. Big round of jazz hands. We're going to go to, we have time for one more speech. So we're going to hear from Jennifer in the negative, if you'll unmute and give your speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Mr. Chair, and I want to thank everybody for their thoughts tonight. I want to address something that I've heard in multiple speeches, and that's the emotional aspect. And I want to give practical ideas for moving forward. I'm a social work student, and I did a literature review on radicalizations this summer. And I believe that behind every strong or extreme opinion is some form of grief, loss, pain, or fear. We are emotional beings who then rationalize our positions with intellectual arguments, even if not especially extreme positions. We are treating censorship right now as an intellectual question, but depolarization and social healing are emotional processes. I was taught growing up that emotions were irrational and should be dismissed in intellectual arguments, but they are data. They are information that our bodies send to our brains about our needs. When we only treat the views as an intellectual exercise, we miss an opportunity. What if we process the emotional roots of the views, not just debate about the symptom? What if we spent our energy learning to practice hearing the pain and fear beneath it, being present with it, and offering a moment of healing? So here are some things to start with, some practical ideas. Our nervous systems have different aspects. When we feel activated and agitated, we are in a sympathetic nervous system, which is fight, flight, freeze. In order to in that place, we are cut off from any capacity to use our prefrontal cortex. So we need to learn to settle our nervous systems. If you want to learn more, you can Google polyvagal theory, Bruce Perry's What Happened to You, or Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands. We need to learn to resettle our nervous systems. That's the first thing. The second thing is within our own pain, grief, loss, and fear, we need to develop a self-compassion practice to be able to hear and process our own pain. And for that, I would point you to Kristen Neff. Once we have made this space where we have processed our own pain and grief and loss and fear, we have the space to hear other stories. So when we hear an extremist view, we can ask them, how did you get to that place? Where does that come from? What happened that you come there? So within the context of our current culture, I am a con. I'm against the idea of extremist views on campuses because of the disproportionate harm that they cause, the amount of emotional energy that they cause different people who already lack power generally. However, if we caught up our emotional skills up to the level of our intellectual acuity in that culture, we would have a different system, we would have different views, and then I would be a pro.
Thank you so much. Big round of jazz hands. Yep, we're going to go to Mr. Slocum for our first question. If you all unmute and ask your question to me.
Certainly. Thanks for calling my name out. For the speaker, I'd like to ask her, and I've heard different things from people on the con side. Who decides what the proper time and place is? What should be allowed? What speech we should be protected from? What's misinformation? What's dehumanizing? What's extreme? And I've also, on the more positive side, I've heard critical thinking. And isn't one of the reasons for going to college to learn how to critically think and protect ourselves from those views that we might be opposed to or might be hurtful? And shouldn't we learn how to protect ourselves from those words in an old-fashioned sticks and stones sort of way?
Great, thank you. Jennifer, you have up to 1 minute to answer.
Thank you so much. In terms of the sticks and stones, I want to address that point first. If we have not learned to regulate our nervous systems, then more stress creates sensitivity. When we learn to go into the parasympathetic nervous system on a regular basis and nurture that space, that's where we become resilient. So this is the same idea as an Olympic athlete training. If you lift weights all the time, you're not getting stronger. The stronger is learning to rest. So I feel like there is a danger in telling people to toughen up if we haven't learned the process of rest and recovery. And this isn't something that's very common in our culture. So I'm not saying like you should just lie around and not do anything, but I feel that that we don't talk about what constructive rest and what constructive recovery are. So we're all kind of we're all activated. So I would say that the sticks and stones, excuse me, that there's a skill there that's really lacking, that we need to be talking more about. In terms of the other questions, respectfully, I do think those ask the wrong questions right now, because in my opinion, if I could give this metaphor with great respect, what I see is people being given a stage with a gaping wound, and we're asking about, and we're posing questions about the intellectual part of their views instead of saying, how do we resolve this problem?
Thank you.
And I say that with great respect, sir.
Thank you. Our last question is going to come from Mr. Hines. If you'd unmute and ask your question to me. You are still muted.
Oh, thank you very much.
There we go.
I was actually, I was so enthralled listening to the answers, I actually forgot what my question was, so I will cede my time to someone else. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Mr. Halston, if you'll unmute and ask your question to me.
All right. I will say that I'm impressed with what the speaker had to say, and I definitely agree with her analysis of how our emotional responses can guide our intellectual. My concern is that I don't know when this would ever cease to be true, though. I meditate myself. I believe it's valuable. I believe that we all should move towards more equanimity and ability to deal with our emotions. But just realistically, when would we ever be able to have free speech on campus if we're going to wait until we're all more evolved beings?
Thank you for thank you. I thank him for his question. To speak directly, maybe we won't, and that would be okay. But we owe it to ourselves to try. And I think it's not only about settling our nervous systems, but processing our stories. I want to make clear that there's a difference between clean pain and dirty pain. Clean pain is when we are sitting with our emotions and allowing ourselves to process them. Dirty pain is when we create stories of blame that we attach to. Okay, but I can also say that learning these skills and emotional granularity, I could not have given this talk 15 years ago. So even within my own life, I was a big part of the problem. And by working on myself, I'm helping others too. And every single one of us can be a vector for that change. So it's a challenge now.
Great. Thank you so much. With that, the speaker is thanked, and that concludes the speech part of our debate.